Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to our next installment on the Civil War. With this particular video, we are going to finish up 1863 and move on into 1864. So we're approaching the nearly the end of this national catastrophe, this war, and I want you to think about a question, ponder another question, reflect on another question as we move ahead. And this time, the question is, why did the Civil War last 4 years? And it may sound like an absurd question at first, except when you start thinking about all the advantages, the incredible, almost unsurmountable advantages that the North had over the South. Um, why in the world did it even last up to 4 years? What was behind that? What did we know about what the North had, but what did the North not have that contributed to this war lasting as long as 4 years? We know about what the South didn't have, but what did the South have that perhaps could explain why this war lasted this long? So I want you to think about that question. Last time we spoke, Lee's had another victory at Chancellorsville. He's humiliated yet another Union general, Joseph Hooker, and the blood is up. Lee is feeling confident again, not very impressed with his rivals. And so Lee, once again, is on march. Once again, he's going to give it another try. He's not going to lose any of his secret plans. He's going to attempt to invade the North once again. Pretty much the same idea. Find his way around the Union Army, swoop into the northern end of Washington, D.C., possibly corner Lincoln, force him to accept Southern independence. There's other forces at work, though. There's also a growing peace movement among the Democrats. Remember, there's still a two-party system in the North. The Republicans still have an opposition party to deal with, which is the Northern Democrats. And there's a growing faction of that Democratic Party that wants peace, wants a negotiated peace to this war. Lee's also thinking, you put up a good of enough show, maybe even, putting Southern boots in Washington, D.C., and this could quite possibly fuel louder demands among the population of the North to reach a settlement with the South. So Gettysburg, this is the pivotal moment of the war. Gettysburg is a town in Pennsylvania. It's about 31 miles north of the Maryland border. It's the furthest north Lee's army is ever going to march. It's going to end up being the largest battle of the entire war by the sheer number of troops that are going to send on this town. There was a myth for many years that Lee headed towards Gettysburg because he heard there was a shoe factory there and his men were in need of shoes, but that's pretty much been debunked by this point. The truth of it was advanced, troops from both sides simply bumped into each other in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So it plays out over the course of 3 days. And since this is not a military history course, we're going to move through it pretty quick. So like I said, on day one, it's just a matter of circumstance. It's like complete circumstance that forward troops on both sides bump into each other west of town. There is fighting from the morning into the afternoon until, Confederate reinforcements begin to arrive from the west and northwest of Gettysburg, driving George Meade is the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac now, driving his forces out of town um, into an elevated position along what they called Cemetery Ridge outside of town. And he reforms his lines in the form of a fishhook. And this is interesting. And the fishhook is actually pretty advantageous because it allows the center to be reinforced by his right flank and vice versa. By the end of the day, you're going to have 90,000 Union soldiers and 75,000 Confederate soldiers descend on this town in Pennsylvania. Day two, both sides extend their lines further south. They're trying to get a hold on some substantially elevated positions south of town. Little Round Top, Big Round Top. Elevation is good. Elevation lets you see um, the chessboard, if you will. Also gives you, if you put artillery on that elevated point, gives you a huge advantage over your enemy. So both sides extend their lines southwards. General Longstreet pretty much spends all day launching wave after wave of assaults at Devil's Den and Little Round Top, trying to get uh, Confederate boots on those positions. Ultimately, he fails. He fails because of a main regiment stubbornly holds on to Little Round Top, and it's led by a very interesting person, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who, this comes down to hand-to-hand combat using bayonets, and he basically repels him and his main regiment. And he's actually a philosophy professor from Harvard, believe it or not, and he repels wave after wave of Confederate assaults until he secures Little Round Top, and plays a huge role in how this entire battle is going to play out. And they're fighting until like 10 o'clock at night, along the in front. Day 3 comes around. In the morning, Lee concentrates his efforts on Meade's right flank around Culp's Hill. He believes he sees a weakness there. He's hoping he could take Culp's Hill, but it's really a secondary objective, more of a diversion than anything else. He's hoping, that Meade will pay a lot of attention to Lee's efforts along Culp Hill, and then Lee's going to switch it up later on in the day and go for Meade's center. And sure enough, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Lee opens up a artillery barrage on Meade's center. Meade, also having artillery of his own, he returns fire, and you have an exchange of artillery on both sides. Both sides are trying what they call soften up or weaken the numbers, weed out the numbers in the center. Lee, not having quite caused the damage that he had hoped to, nonetheless at 3 p.m. orders perhaps his most infamous order. He orders Major General George Pickett to take 12,000 men and charge the Union center. These 12,000 men are going to run about a mile uphill. And so Lee gives the order to charge, and they do so. Half of those men are never going to reach the front line of the Union center. They're going to be mowed down along the way, both by rifle fire and artillery shelling. And of the half of the men that do reach the Union line, pretty much that half, about all of them are going to be killed or taken prisoner. Pickett's charge is an absolute disaster. Okay, Lee loses a substantial chunk of what's left of his army. I think something like 30% of his army, because of that one ill-fated attempt to take the Union center. At the end of day 3, you have 23,000 Union casualties and 28,000 Confederate casualties on some of the hottest days of the year in July, because this is, a summer battle. It's nightfall, day 4, Lee falls back, strengthens his lines, kind of daring Meade to come after him. Meade does not take the bait, and then Lee calls a retreat into the mountains to the west and eventually across West Virginia and into Virginia. Well, we've seen this before. Lincoln's not happy that Meade's pretty beat up himself, that Meade did not pursue Lee and destroy his army. And so Meade is going to find himself demoted. Once again, the public is exposed to these very graphic images of the very realities of war. Some of these images were staged, like bodies were actually dragged to these places, just so you know. But it does begin to change people's perspectives of war and starts to fuel this growing peace movement in the North, pretty much among Democrats. So how are things going in the West at about the same time? So Gettysburg concludes on July 3rd. But in the West, there's been a lot of action ever since May. The objective of taking the Mississippi River away from the Confederates is not quite complete. We know that Admiral Farragut, started his way up the mouth of the Mississippi River, worked his way up a substantial portion of Louisiana. Grant, starting, with his success at Shiloh, begins to work his way south. But still, by mid-1863, the Confederates control a substantial chunk of the Mississippi River, from Vicksburg, Mississippi, all the way down to Port Hudson, Louisiana. And this portion of river that they control is essential. It allows supplies like lead, like beef, like sugar, um, to supply the Confederacy from as far away as Texas and vice versa. They need that. And Grant needs to break that. He needs to take Vicksburg. Vicksburg is really hard to take. That hairpin turn that you see there in the picture. Vicksburg is not only jam-packed with coastal batteries that will protect it from any type of attempts to take it by the river, that hairpin turn doesn't help either. Um, so, Grant has to figure out another way. He needs to take Vicksburg in order to complete the mission of taking away the Mississippi River. His adversary is Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, very little combat experience, but nonetheless, he is the commander of the Army of Mississippi, the Confederate Army that is tasked with defending Vicksburg, the South's last stand along the Mississippi River. And there's also something important. Vicksburg also is the terminal point of a rail line that goes all the way to Jackson, Mississippi. So the Southerners receive a lot of supplies from the western half of the Confederacy, and a lot of these supplies head to Jackson and are spread out throughout what's left of the Confederacy. Grant realizes he cannot try a frontal attack either by land or by river against Vicksburg, so he tries another way. And he finds downriver, he's looking for a weak link, a soft spot that he could cross. And at Brainsburg is when he does so. At Brainsburg, his army crosses over into the Confederate side of the river. And instead of going straight for Vicksburg, he does something unexpected. He rushes for Jackson, which is the capital of Mississippi, and it's not really that defended, or at least not as defended as Vicksburg. All the resources are in Vicksburg. So Grant heads to Jackson, forcing Pemberton out of Vicksburg to respond and defend Jackson, Mississippi. Well, needless to say, Grant gets to Jackson and takes Jackson. Um, quite easily, in fact. And while doing so, he cuts the rail line, okay, at Jackson. Now that rail line only goes from Jackson to Vicksburg, and then orders his men to start destroying that rail line, as from that point they start marching towards towards Vicksburg. Pemberton's men tried to stop the advance. In doing so, they lose 25% of their men, until eventually, by May, Grant is right there, at the entrance of Vicksburg. But Vicksburg has some pretty solid defenses. Pemberton has pulled back into the city. He's basically surrounded. The Union Navy is poised to start an assault on the coast of Vicksburg. Grant um, is preparing an overland frontal assault into the city. And so here's where we see one of the first instances. This is a very different scenario that this war hasn't experienced yet. We have civilians now caught up in this. A Confederate general, what's left of his army, is holed up inside a population center. I guess you use the modern terminology of using the population as human shields. Grant is positioning his army to lay siege on this city, to enter it by land while the Navy assaults it by the coast. And, and a new way of thinking begins to enter the equation. Like all these guys, when they went to West Point, they all studied Napoleon. They all know the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's great victories and defeats like the back of their hand. There was a guy who was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars on the Russian side, Baron von Clausewitz. And he writes a book on theory on war, in which, based on his observations of what he noticed during the Napoleonic Wars, he makes a number of, I guess, predictions about the future of warfare. That warfare is going to, war is going to start expanding beyond the battlefield. Okay, as societies grow more complex, victory in war is going to become a more complex goal to reach, and because of that, the generals are going to have to start thinking more broadly about what victory means or what you have to do to gain victory. And it's more than just soldiers. It's pulling all of your resources of your society toward this end goal of victory. But it's not only your society and using all of its resources towards this goal, but also waging war on all fronts. The idea of total war, and there's a couple of layers here, is that the wars of the future are no longer going to simply be fought among soldiers on the battlefield, but it's also going to take place. There's going to be politics affecting the enemy's internal politics, economic warfare, which the Navy was already conducting, affecting your enemy's ability to trade and conduct commerce. The spread of misinformation, the spread of propaganda, that's another form of warfare, altering your enemy's attitudes, behavior, inducing fear in your enemy, and creating divisions within their population. And lastly, the idea about civilians. Civilians are maybe not necessarily non-targets. That maybe civilians are legitimate targets during war. The argument, it's kind of a very difficult argument to get at. Civilians support the army. If you want to hurt the army, civilians inevitably are a target. And Clausewitz was saying that with each new conflict, civilians are going to pay a larger and larger price. And we talk about conflicts today, that's exactly what's happened. So what am I getting at? Grant has to make a very controversial decision. Is he willing to endanger civilians in order to accomplish his goal of taking Vicksburg? Does Grant believe in total war? Yes, he does. And he opens siege on, he lays siege on Vicksburg despite the fact that there are citizens and civilians in there. And this is going to become a new trend during the war. The siege begins on May 18th. 47 days. Grant's artillery bombards, those 8 miles of defenses outside the city, and eventually, pounds its way into the city while ironclads are pounding the coastal defenses. The population becomes hungry. The soldiers have nothing to eat. The people inside have nothing to eat. They're eating dogs and cats and rats and what have you. And on July 4th, General Pemberton signals his willingness to surrender. He wants a meeting with Grant, and he gets one, and he asks Grant for what conditions. And here's another controversial aspect of the war that sounded really good at the time, but it ends up almost being a bad idea. And this is going to be part of the American military tradition going into World War II. Grant says, nothing. I want unconditional surrender. You will surrender without condition. You will surrender 100% under my terms. And this sounds really macho, and it sounds really great. But when you do that, guess what you just threw out the window? the ability to negotiate a peace before you get to total destruction. The ability to possibly end this war earlier is thrown out the window by insisting on unconditional surrender. Just to let you know how long people carry grudges, the town of Vicksburg would not celebrate another 4th of July, which is the date that their city fell, for the next 80 years. Here's a picture of the ironclads taking the coast. And just as Grant takes Vicksburg, the Navy takes Fort Hudson to the south, and by the time those two battles are complete, the Union controls the entirety of the Mississippi River. And that's when the shortages in the South are really going to start to take place, particularly salt shortages. People will not be able to cure their meats. And you would think, and yes, there's great celebration in the North over these two, finally, if not complete, arguably Union victories, both in Gettysburg and Vicksburg, that happened within a day of each other. Okay? And yet, less than a week later, you have the worst, deadliest riots this country has ever seen. The New York City draft riots. Draft riots, yes, because they were rooted in a very unpopular measure that both governments had already turned to because of the unexpected amount of death on both of their sides. And it proves to be quite unpopular, and it proves to end up fueling a certain opposition to the war. The Confederacy was here's the thing, this is the first time the United States ever turns to conscription to get men to fight a war. And technically, the Confederacy is the first one that does it. After the Peninsula Campaign and the number of men that Lee lost in the defense of Richmond, the Confederacy passes their first conscription law. It basically drafts men between the ages of 18 and 35 for up to 3 years. This is the only way that the South could deal with its manpower challenge. By the end of the war, they're going to extend these age limits from 17 to 50. So they're going to start drafting 50-year-old men. And of course, there's exceptions. If you own more than 20 or more slaves, you're exempt from the draft. And of course, this is going to cause a lot of anger and resentment among poor whites. They're going to be drafted to go into this war. The Union, not much later, in fact, after their loss at Fredericksburg and before Charlottesville, the Union passes its own conscription act. Okay? And basically all citizens and immigrants that have filed for citizenship between the ages of 20 to 45 can be drafted to go to the war. Prior to this, they left it up to states and state governors to draft men into the militia and, and volunteers. These are the first ever national drafts. Okay? And in New York, they don't take it very well. Despite Gettysburg and Vicksburg, they don't take it well. And on July 13th to the 16th, violence erupts. It starts mostly among white working class men, angry about the draft. And for some strange reason, it turns into a race war. They begin to direct their anger at the free black residents of New York City. It's anger about the draft. It's anger at free blacks and competition for jobs. It's angry at wealthy New Yorkers and the fact that they paid $300, they can exempt themselves from the war. So they decide to rampage through Manhattan, attack just about every African American that they see, every African American business. There is lynchings. The police cannot control it until eventually troops fresh from Gettysburg, the Army of the Potomac, is ordered by Lincoln to march into Washington, D.C. Will march into New York City and establish order using deadly force. So if we were to see something like that in the news today, we would be shocked. But yes, the Union Army marched into New York City and using deadly force suppressed those riots after 3 days and restored order. To date, it's the worst, most destructive riot in terms of life in U.S. history. 120 people died and 2,000 were injured as a result of that draft. So let's go back to the West. Now that the river is taken, what's next? Now the secondary objective. To carve a wound right through the middle of the South, starting with Tennessee. Okay, Western Tennessee was was never. I'm sorry, Eastern Tennessee was never really for secession, and so the North is going to take that at their advantage. So the story begins actually with Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Now, Braxton Bragg, the year earlier in 1862, had actually launched an invasion of Kentucky, hoping to perhaps agitate pro-secessionist elements inside Kentucky to get the state to secede from the Union. Didn't work out that well, was driven out of Kentucky, back into Tennessee. Um, he loses Nashville, which is the state capital, the day after Christmas of 1862. And he is pursued by Major General William Rosecrans, who is commanding the Army of the Cumberland. And so Rosecrans is pursuing Bragg, and Bragg falls back further south. He fell back after he lost Nashville at the Battle of Stones River outside of Murfreesboro. He falls back further south again to Taloma, Tennessee. Eventually, he loses that by June, and he fears that the Union target is Chattanooga. Remember, they're going after means of transportation. They got the rivers. Now they're going to go after rail lines. The whole point is to cripple the South's ability to supply its armies. Now they're going to go after rail lines, and Rosecrans wants to go for Chattanooga. Uh, General Bragg does his best to to keep Rosecrans at bay, but Rosecrans has the numbers. At the Battle of Chickamauga, um, it may seem like a Confederate defeat, but it's not. Bragg basically hands over Chattanooga to Rosecrans. Rosecrans occupies Chattanooga. The Union has Chattanooga, but is not in the best position because then at that point Bragg falls back to elevated positions outside of the town of Chattanooga. Chattanooga's below, and he begins to lay, siege on the Union forces below him. So that was like a strategic retreat. And despite, well, even you even saw generals lose their jobs in the Confederacy. Um, his Despite the fact that he pulled off a pretty ingenious maneuver by handing Rosecrans um, Chattanooga, but he has actually the high ground. People like Davis aren't happy the fact that he was, he wasn't able to keep Tennessee. Now the Union controls not just eastern Tennessee, but all of middle Tennessee, and so they replace him, of course. Um, Not immediately that. He still has one more fight to go. They actually replace Rosecrans. The Union leadership is not happy with the fact that Rosecrans got trapped by Bragg inside Chattanooga. And so that takes us to the Chattanooga campaign, which is at the end in November of 1863. Who do we find showing up in Chattanooga? General Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant shows up with massive reinforcements. Um, he arrives pretty much with the Army of the Tennessee. 4 divisions of the Army of the Potomac also arrive under the command of General Hooker. Now, despite having the lower elevation, now with just so many more numbers than Bragg has, he's able to launch assaults at Lookout Mountain and Seminary Ridge, and eventually he drives Bragg out of the high ground surrounding Chattanooga. And so at this point, it was when Bragg is replaced by somebody else. And it's this last victory in the West by Grant, which actually gets Grant a promotion. Lincoln has been following the progress that Grant has been making in the West. He's pretty much the only general among the Union generals that has had anything you could call luck. And Lincoln actually recalls him to Washington. For what reason? Grant's going to get a promotion. Grant's going to become the new general in chief of all Union forces and pretty much take command of the Army of the Potomac. So that's an image of the battle for Lookout Mountain, I believe. Before the year's over, taking us back to Gettysburg for a second, so many men died on that battlefield. Um, Union soldiers were buried. Confederate soldiers, for the most part, were just left to rot, to tell you the truth. The federal government makes a decision to create the first national military cemetery. Cemeteries are a new thing. Cemeteries emerged. How do we bury so many corpses, you know, in one place? Before, people got buried in their backyards, in the graveyard, on the church grounds. Now you have this thing called cemeteries. And you have some officials show up. They're going to dedicate Gettysburg, the area around Gettysburg, and turn into a national cemetery. Abraham Lincoln's invited. He doesn't really have anything. On the train, the story is on the train, he uses his top hat as a desk. He puts it on his lap. And he actually writes down a speech. It's not a long speech. It takes about 2 minutes. And then when he gets there, he takes to the stage and he delivers a 2-minute speech that blows everybody's mind, reaffirming what this war is about. Okay? Almost, you could almost say creating a born again movement. If this country was ever born again, if this republic was ever born again, redefined, given new purpose, many point to those 2 minutes that came out of Lincoln's mouth. And many of you are familiar with the words. Not all of them are there, but 7 years ago it begins. But the most powerful words are the ending, and that government by the people, for the people, and of the people shall not perish from the earth. So that's 1863. This is what the war looks like by 64. The Union controls the Mississippi. They have separated good chunks of Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. Now, parts of Louisiana under Union occupation, parts of Arkansas are under Union occupation. Pretty much all of Tennessee is under Union occupation. Chunks of East Virginia are under Union occupation. And so the Anaconda Plan is working out the way it's supposed to, little by little. They are losing ground, but here they are. They continue to fight. It's the third year of this war. General Grant's promotion means that his number two now gets to be the commander of the Army of the Tennessee, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, who shares a lot of the same ideas with General Grant. General Braxton Bragg being removed from command. Now they bring back the old war horse that has healed from his injuries, General Joseph Johnston. Now the next objective of the Army of the Tennessee, having taken Chattanooga and those very important rail lines, many of them that head out east and supply, places as far away as Richmond. Now they're going to continue on to the next city that's a significant rail hub, and that is Atlanta. The Confederate leadership entrusts General Johnston installing and keeping General Sherman from reaching Atlanta. Johnston's a cautious general. Sherman's a very aggressive one. And he tries throughout the month of May and June and most of July. Johnston does what he can with his army to stall Sherman's advance. but it's an inevitable thing. Sherman eventually reaches Atlanta. Upon reaching Atlanta, the Confederate leadership is unhappy with Johnston's efforts at stopping Sherman's advance and is going to end up replacing him too. And now Atlanta is in danger of being overrun by Union troops, and the South is going to lose another important railroad hub. Thus begins the Battle of Atlanta. And here we are, siege warfare again, just like we saw in Chattanooga, just like we saw in Vicksburg. That's something that's starting to pop up now. The younger general that's a replacement for Johnston is Lieutenant General John Bell Hood, who is much more aggressive. He basically organizes the defense of Atlanta, setting up trenches and obstacles and whatnot. They're pretty good. Sherman eventually, figures out that it's impenetrable. There's no way that he's going to pierce his way through Hood's defenses. So Sherman goes about it a different way. He goes around the city and severs the rail lines leading into Atlanta. That means if Hood won't let me into the city by force, then I will starve him out. Let's see how long he's willing to stay into that city without being supplied by the outs by this by the anything outside of Atlanta. It doesn't take long, okay? It doesn't take long. Pretty much the rest of July into the first week of August, Hood basically decides to cut his losses and leave Atlanta. He kind of tries to like lure. He tries to lure Sherman away with 40,000 troops. Um, Heads towards Nashville, hoping that Sherman will take the bait, or at least part of Sherman's army will take the bait and follow Hood. But he doesn't. He just lets Hood go. Hood's going to be taken care of later on. And that means Sherman enters Atlanta on August 2nd and occupies um, that city and that very important rail hub. And here's some of the guns that the Sherman used to breach the defenses of that city. In coordination with the taking of Atlanta, um, the Navy starts taking important ports. Mobile, Alabama. The Navy takes in the Battle of Mobile Bay, which is infamous because it was pretty heavily defended, and Admiral David Farragut supposedly straps himself to the deck of his ship and says something along the lines of "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," and actually takes Mobile. And all of this is important. And the taking of Atlanta was important. And the taking of Mobile was important. Because there's an election coming up. Okay? And a lot was riding on that election. And those victories, very much so, contributed to Lincoln's chances of winning. And this is interesting. Here we are in the middle of an existential war for the future of this Union. And Lincoln does not suspend, does not postpone, goes ahead with the upcoming election. His party is starting to listen. Whether the South is going to lose this war or not, the odds are pointing in that direction greatly, so much more than they did before, despite their successes in the battlefield. Now Lincoln and the Republican Party are starting to make gestures in the direction of reconciliation. For one race, for one campaign year, 1 year alone, the Republican Party renames itself the National Union Party. Hannibal Hamlin, who had been President Lincoln's vice president up to now, is actually sidestepped and replaced with Andrew Johnson, longtime senator from Tennessee, a Unionist, Southerner, a Unionist. He never left Washington, D.C. He was actually made military governor of Tennessee since 62 up until the end of the war. He's a Democrat. Why is a Republican running with a Democrat? Why is a Northerner running with a Southerner? Again, the message is we could work this out together. This is a unity ticket. There's still an opposition party. The Democrats are going to run their own candidate. Well, look there. Look who's made a comeback. A man that has a gripe against President Lincoln. Look who it is. General George McClellan decides to challenge Lincoln for the presidency. I guess it's like, well, you dismissed me. I'm going to show you. I'm going to run for president. Um, the Democrats are split. You have your peace Democrats, the ones that want a negotiated peace with the South, an end to the killing and dying. And then you have your war Democrats. And McClellan was a war Democrat. But nonetheless, this becomes the underlying message of the election. A vote for Lincoln is a vote to continue to the war till the end, unconditional surrender. A vote for McClellan is a vote for negotiated peace and an end of the war. Okay? Hence, the Confederacy had a lot riding on, had a lot of their hopes pinned on a possible McClellan upset. That's what Lee was going for, to weaken Lincoln's stature and hopefully weaken him leading up to the election. Okay? The states of the Confederacy do not vote, of course. They do not participate, which is weird because Lincoln doesn't consider them part of the Union except for an election. They're not part of the Union. Um, Only those states still in the Union get to vote. And Lincoln does fantastically well, particularly among the soldier vote. Lincoln wins 55% of the. And I want you to think about that for a second. Now, Lincoln just absolutely landslide, 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21 electoral votes. McClellan pretty much only does well in Kentucky and New Jersey and Delaware. And Lincoln just does well everything else. But think about that. As loved and revered and almost godlike, that we look at Lincoln today, even within the Union, he only commanded the support of little more than half of the people. 45% of people wanted McClellan. Imagine had the South voted, hypothetically. Imagine if the South would have voted, what would have been the outcome? So while Lincoln was alive, while Lincoln was president, do not make the mistake that he was revered and loved by everyone, even in the North. 45% of people, that's almost half, did not support his presidency. But he pulls it off. An electoral landslide, much of it helped by soldiers. And now Lincoln has a mandate to continue this war. The voters gave him a mandate to continue this war to its bitter end. And the Confederacy has lost its last chance to end this war. Foreign intervention, that ended years ago. Maybe ending the war with a McClellan win, that's gone now. So you really have to question ask, after the election of 64, why exactly are the Confederates still fighting? Okay? What are they fighting for? The odds of them winning are next to zero at this point. So, an infamous act. And of course, taking Atlanta helped Lincoln incredibly so. And once Lincoln wins, then Sherman is free to do as he pleases. Only 1 week after Lincoln wins, um, the Union Army is going to commit itself to perhaps one of its most infamous decisions. Sherman is going to order his army to march to Savannah, Georgia. but there's a lot of details to fill in there. Okay. Before he leaves Atlanta, as a goodbye present to make sure that the people of Atlanta don't forget General Sherman and the Union Army, he's going to order the city burnt down to the ground. Uh, Sherman is also a believer in total war. Sherman wants to make this war horrible, terrible, so that they'll never think of secession again. Okay? And this is the way he's going to make this war terrible. He wants to cut open a gaping, bleeding wound right through the heart of the South. And he's going to order his men to march 300 miles to Savannah. And he's going to order them. Whatever you see, they're cutting the supply lines. They're going to march on their stomachs, as you would say. And anything we run into, you take what you want, and what you have no use for, you destroy. Homes, farms, plantations, anything in the way is going to be looted for what has a value, with the order that, and what we can't take with us, you destroy. You burn fields, you slaughter animals, you leave death, destruction, and ash in its wake. Yes, rape becomes a part of this. And this is where Union soldiers start gaining the reputation of being rapists. But folks, this is the history of warfare. It's been going on since antiquity, even till war today. Okay? And Sherman's Army of the Tennessee scorches a path of destruction all the way to Savannah, freeing 25,000 slaves along the way, by the way. But so 300 miles long, 15 miles wide, they destroy everything in their path. Eventually, Sherman gets to Savannah just before Christmas and offers it to President Lincoln as a Christmas present. Later on, it's kind of foreshadowing. He's going to march into Columbia, South Carolina in February and burn that place down. What to do with the 25,000 slaves? Sherman was not really an abolitionist. His sympathies were somewhere between kind of seeing the South's point of view and being indifferent to the plight of slaves. But as a matter of practicality, all the whites had abandoned, had run away from Sherman's path, so there's nobody there. Lands have been abandoned, and he doesn't want to continue to feed the slaves that he liberates from every plantation. So this is what he cooks up as his solution. And there's been talk already about, okay, once this war is over, what about punishment? Are we going to punish landowners for their involvement in secession and rebellion and this war? And if so, how are we going about doing that? Are we going to give land to their slaves? And that was something that was really that was a consideration that was taken seriously for some time. And General Sherman passes Special Field Order 15. Therefore, allotting 40-acre plots along the Georgia and South Carolina coast per black family. And an army mule, because they had an excess of army mules. So thus began the hope that slave families would be compensated, okay, for their bondage with the land of traitors and rebels who justly lost their land because they rebelled against, the government of the United States and committed treason. This is where much of the conversation of reparations for slavery comes from. Needless to say, a little bit later in class, you're going to see how Andrew Johnson actually cancels General Sherman's Special Field Order 15, the 40 acres and a mule, and all the white landowners are allowed to legally regain their land. So, That was 63 and 64. Next time we talk, we finish this thing.